The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Want the real story behind the sound bites and headlines? Let's find the facts. Remember, it's not a conspiracy theory if it's the truth. You are not paranoid or confused. You just need to know.
Welcome, everybody. It is time for another edition of the show that you never want to miss because you need to know. Kip Keefer here on TKR. Voice a little raspy this morning. Long weekend. We won't get into that subject because that's things you don't need to know. But I do want to talk about everything that's happening around us, swirling at warp speed. You know, my friends, I think it's amazing to point out that on the front end here, that from my seat of commentating and bringing you up to date with things that you might not necessarily not hear, everybody's aware of the headlines and they follow the sound bites and they hear the summaries by various people wherever you get your information, whether it's online, it's through X, which used to be Twitter, which has become a big news source for a lot of people, whether it's just things that pop up on your feeds from TikTok and YouTube and different services. You see the headlines, you're aware of what's going on, but it's amazing how the depth of that is very seldom explored. And when it is explored, it is explained in a way of sort of, I don't know, tainting the information. That's probably not the best description. Let's just say spinning, because that's become the common vernacular in terms of styling information to suit one's own purposes. So it's spun to kind of reflect what they want you, the commentator, to actually grasp. And I pride myself, and I hope that you all have listened to Need to Know and understand that that is not my objective when I come on this program and talk about things that are happening, because what I want to do is go beyond just the headlines and the sound bites, and again, the spin of what every individual person is trying to get you to think or trying to lead you to believe, because that's not my agenda. My agenda, as I've explained many times here, is to kind of call out a lot of that information that is done with that in mind, because what I want you to do is have every side of a particular issue so you can think about it and make your own decisions and draw your own conclusions. That's the whole idea behind Need to Know. And, you know, I'll my opinions, of course, get into a lot of the things we talk about. But again, I challenge anybody to produce one shred of information I give that's trying to tell you what to think, because to me, that violates every purpose of doing this show and spending all the time that I do watching and listening and reacting to things I hear other people say and see how stories are covered. A couple of things right on the front end to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. There's been tons of coverage. Just think of the last week since I've come on with you. We did get on last Monday and talk about what happened in Butler, Ohio on Saturday afternoon, early evening, the attempted shooting of Donald Trump by a 20-year-old assassin who was neutralized in that process. That was kind of the precursor. But can you imagine that since we have visited about 48 hours after that shooting, the Republican National Convention cranked up in Milwaukee, It was a really eclectic sort of gathering because, unlike the Republican Party events in the past, where there's been a lot of bickering and backfighting and different philosophical approaches, because you started to see at the advent of the Donald Trump era, which was 2016, at that convention, it was very much divided. It was the first steps toward Donald Trump trying to rally people to the Republican side who had never been there. And in fact, there was great suspicion in 2016 that Donald Trump was not a true Republican. He was running for president in 2016 against the ultimate machine politician on the Democrat side, one Hillary Rodham Clinton. Of course, Bill Clinton had been the president for 2 terms in the early parts of the 2000s before giving way to George W. Bush. After the Bush years, there was a big push, of course, for change, and Barack Obama. I said early 2000s. That was Obama's time. Clinton, of course, in the 90s. So there'd been some Democratic changeover. There had been George W. Bush, and then there was Barack Obama, who seized the presidency and was trying to pass the torch after 8 years in office to Hillary Clinton. And Donald Trump said enough of that. So that's when he came down the escalator at Trump Tower and ran against Hillary for the presidency in 2016. And one of the ways that he attacked that appalled people in the Republican Party. And there are still those individuals out there that don't believe that Donald Trump is a true Republican in the great tradition of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and of course, others that are considered party icons like John McCain. Um, they're appalled that Donald Trump had made his appeal to defeat Hillary Clinton to working people and people in unions and places where the Republican Party had never had support before, because you've seen an amazing thing happen in this country. And if you're not aware of it, it's important that you know, and you need to know, the following information. The one time in American history that we had the situation that we were facing until 24 hours ago was in the late 1800s, when a president by the name of Grover Cleveland, who was the governor of New York and a Democrat, won the presidency away from in a battle with a Republican by the name of Blaine. But the bottom line is Cleveland was the president and was opposed for his second term by a Republican nominee by the name of Benjamin Harrison, a former Civil War general. But Benjamin Harrison was very much in the pocket of big business, corporate structure, the titans of industry, guys like Andrew Carnegie from the steel industry, J.P. Morgan, who was an entrepreneur and banker, of course, and John Rockefeller, who had a monopoly on American energy. Those three basically bankrolled Harrison and bought enough votes in this critical state to win the presidency, New York, to defeat the former New York governor, because if you carried the state of New York in those days with its population domination, you got enough electoral votes basically to win. New York was the key in that era to winning elections because the population was so concentrated in that state. So that the election of 1892 yielded that result, that Benjamin Harrison knocked out the incumbent president running for a second term. After 4 years of basically big steps back on reforms for labor, changing and making it safer for workers and taking away kind of the abusive situations that big business had imposed, and really, the Democrats became the party of the working man, and Grover Cleveland became a populist candidate, which basically the populist movements in throughout history is when the population kind of rises up and says, we're going to stick it to the man here because the man is sticking it to us. So Cleveland came back in the rematch with Harrison. He had been the incumbent. Harrison had taken his presidency. Cleveland came back with sweeping support of all kinds of workers and common folk, and reclaimed the White House in that rematch. So we had, except for the parties, the exact same scenario here. We had Joe Biden, who was bounced into office despite great concerns by folks like me who knew even 4 years ago that Joe Biden was basically an empty shell, even in his prime, throughout his 50 years on Capitol Hill. Work. He never had a real job. He was a government guy. He was corrupt. We won't get into all that, but basically, his family had made millions of dollars capitalizing on his positions as a senator for a long time, and of course, vice president for 8 years. Uh, he was put into office basically by the corporate complex in this country, by Hollywood, and by backroom party leaders who wanted to reclaim the presidency from Donald Trump. It was a very similar situation. And yes, the parties were reversed. This time, Trump was a Republican, although there are Republicans in the ranks that still don't accept him. They hate the fact that he did what Cleveland did in 1896. Grover Cleveland won that election, predicated 1894 actually, predicated on the fact that he was the populist candidate. Well, now all of a sudden history was repeating itself, but this time it was a Republican who was the populist candidate. And you had people through the Rust Belt of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan who had never, ever voted for a Republican candidate before sweep Donald Trump into the White House with a resounding electoral college victory over Hillary Clinton. So the roles have reversed in these parties. The elites, the big money people, the gigantic corporations, the elites in Hollywood, they have completely transformed the situation between Democrat and Republican. The roles have reversed. Now, if you watch the Republican convention, you saw a completely united Republican Party. There was no convention in 2020 because of COVID, but in 2016, there were a lot of people that were appalled that Donald Trump was going to get the nomination because of this sweeping tide of support from blue collar workers and regular folks. Again, the transition was complete, and you still have the bitter and angry McCain politicians. McCain himself, before passing away, remember his last stand, coming back with his brain tumor in the last days of his life. He came back and made a speech about how the Senate needed to be above all of the politics and maintain integrity and be the great institution it was supposed to be. That's all flowery language and great sentiments, but it's not realism. Because if you are the party of great integrity and diplomacy, you are the party that's going to get stepped on and pushed into the mud and completely dominated by the opposite party, who has no intention of having civility and all the things that McCain called for in his farewell speech, because they're going to stomp you in the ground trying to beat you. All these old dinosaurs of the Republican Party who lamented the days of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill arguing jaw to jaw during the day and going out for martinis and steaks at night and having great conversations. That has gone the way of the dodo. This is an adversarial situation in this country. It is just that way. It's sad to say, but that's what it is. And everybody listening needs to recognize that and understand how we've gotten to this point. So the transformation from 2016, when Donald Trump came to the convention, had enough delegates, and got the nomination, despite a lot of the what's become referred to as rhinos, long time old school Republicans just being appalled that this guy was our candidate. And of course, Trump swept to the big White House win with this populist national movement. And it is forgotten that in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, he had reversed a lot of Obama policies. He had gotten the country back online, made the biggest tax cuts in American history, particularly the tax cuts to corporations, which allowed so many businesses that had fled the United States for cheap foreign alternatives to come back, because the tax rate went from somewhere around 35% down to 21. That made it affordable for companies to come back and relocate in our own country and hire and take better care of tons of workers. It was great, a great momentum for those 3 years. The country became energy independent for the first time ever, was exporting fossil fuels and natural gas. And really things were in a very good posture on a world stage. There was real opportunities for Middle East peace, the first time in all of our lifetimes that Israel was about to establish diplomatic relations with several of its major neighbors in the Middle East. The policies and Trump made mistakes. He put some people in his administration that were bad decisions, but he did have enough really good people surrounding him that they got a lot done. Of course, the worst decision was Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions going into the job as Attorney General and completely mucking that up from day one. Within a couple of weeks of his appointment, he recused himself from the Russia Gate investigation, which we now know was 100% absolutely contrived and false. It was a political move, basically initiated by the Clinton campaign to discredit Trump and accuse him of being of all things, Russian agent. And this dishonest news media perpetrated that fraud for the first 2.5 years of his administration, until their own hand-picked group of special prosecutors found absolutely zero evidence and announced in a long report that although there's a lot of things to be concerned about, there's no direct influence with Russia. So that turned out to be a big false story that still today is mentioned. Trump's ties to the Soviet, or it's not the Soviet Union anymore, although it's acting like it in its current posture, but ties to Vladimir Putin and Russia with Donald Trump, which is just absurd. I heard a commentator the other day say something of the effect that Russian interference is already showing its ugly head in our upcoming election, that supposedly there's misinformation out there trying to discredit Joe Biden. And this is when Joe was still on the job. If you haven't heard the headline yet, Joe is out, but we'll talk about that in a second. The bottom line is that they're still suggesting that Vladimir Putin is trying to get Donald Trump reinstalled in the White House, which makes absolutely no sense. Vladimir Putin wants nothing to do with Donald Trump in the White House because the party's over. Vladimir Putin would not have moved one soldier or piece of equipment into Ukraine had Trump been the president still, because the projection of the United States under Trump was the United States is not going to stand for any kind of shenanigans from foreign powers, and they were in check. That's what strong leadership does for you. Joe Biden, being the figurehead president, gave license to a lot of problems around the world. The reemergence of Middle East, uh, basically terrorist organizations that had been completely negated and defeated in the Trump administration. A lot of that comes from the fact that Biden came in and took away all of the sanctions, released a lot of the funding that was frozen for the Iranians who fund about 90% of the world terror, including Hamas and Hezbollah on the borders of Israel. We're back in business with the ascension of Joe Biden to the White House, because the people that were really running the show there have this warped belief, and we still really don't even know the motivations of it, that the key to relations for the United States in the Middle East is an established relationship with Iran, a country that has people in the streets yelling death to America, death to Israel. These people are run by the most radical terrorists on earth. And yet the Obama doctrine was to bend over backwards and try to make accommodations for Iran. And there's a lot of theories on why that is, but it doesn't make any sense. And it was the tinderbox that was rekindled when this administration took office after the 2020 election. Again, you hear Donald Trump making references to 2020 and the election. He doesn't say words like Hillary Clinton said after 2016, that the 2016 election was stolen from her. But he does point out the irregularities with the COVID emergency situation in 2020 and all of the myriad of devices on how people could vote in this time of great chaos and nobody actually going to work. And all of the social distancing and all of the different things that they had, more frauds that they had perpetrated on us for a serious, serious virus, but one that really had devastating effects on older Americans and people with serious health issues. For the bulk of us, it was something to be aware of and something to take caution to try to avoid, big crowds and things where maybe you had a better chance of contracting it. But it turned out to be a big fraud, just like the election in 2020, because that was a license to steal. Joe Biden getting 90 million votes, which is like, I don't know, 15 or 18 million more than anybody else had ever gotten. It was bogus, folks. People were voting 7, 8, 9 times. They were sending in mail-in ballots. They were doing drop-off ballot harvesting. They were going to the polls despite all that because there was no check. There was no cross reference to where and how many times people had voted. Ballots were being printed up and basically the old Chicago politics of dead people voting. There was just no accounting. It was just a giant cluster that was the perfect opportunity to make sure that Joe Biden displaced Donald Trump, because Donald Trump was a wrecking ball for all of the 8 years that Barack Obama had built up the groundwork for this transformation of America. And those are his own words. And the transformation of America was to start taking away a lot of the founding principles, start ignoring provisions of the Constitution that were not acceptable to them, and instituting this change to giant central government. Government is your friend. Government is your keeper. Government is your daddy. Remember what Ronald Reagan said back in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan said, people look to the government for solutions, but they need to understand government's not going to solve your problems. Government is the problem. And truer words were never spoken. Another great Reaganism in that time was, America is a country with a government. It must never be allowed to be the other way around. And he warned that in one generation that all could change if leadership got in place that really kind of enabled that. Obama was a master politician. I don't even rate Barack Obama a bad president. I certainly don't like the philosophical approach that was behind a lot of his decision making. But in terms of being a savvy politician and a really, really bright guy, Barack Obama was a president that was very effective and really didn't infuriate a lot of people because of his savvy and personal style. But at the same time, what Barack Obama was doing was paving the way by just stuffing all these departments and agencies and bureaus in Washington, and there are tens of thousands of people in government, and he basically transformed a lot of those agencies with people from their line of thinking, politicized every bureau and agency and department that needs to operate independently, free of philosophical motivation. The best example, of course, is the Department of Justice and the FBI. These are agencies that need to do their job without political leaders in charge of those agencies making decisions based on what's best for their ideology and not what's best for you and I, the citizens and the CEOs of government. Remember, this is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. That means you and I are the government, not some ideological movement that really wants to transform this into a Marxist system. And that's basically what they're doing. Government knows everything. You know nothing. We're better qualified to make your decisions than you are. And that's the philosophy that we're battling. So Trump last week comes out of the Republican convention with an absolute unified mandate, and look at the eclectic, the three speakers before Trump was brought on stage on the final night really kind of give you an idea of where we are as a country right now, because you had the sequence of Kid Rock, who acclimated one of his songs with Trump lyrics. Then you had Hulk Hogan, the wrestler, who ripped his shirt off, and this was basic Americana. I'm sure the ghosts of John McCain watching this, and all these traditional rhino Republicans who are still railing against Trump and what he's done to their party, were appalled. And then Dana White, the president of UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championships, came on stage and gave a rousing speech talking about he's surrounded by the toughest guys in the world in the organization he runs, and nobody's tougher than Donald Trump, who had just been shot 2 days before and showed up at the Republican convention. And his speech is a little controversial because it started off very somber and very reflective, and it kind of morphed into a rally speech. But again, he's trying to fire up his Republican colleagues who had swept him in with a unanimous delegate count to be nominated. And of course, J.D. Vance, the vice president nominee, only 39 years old, with an amazing story. He's already had a Ron Howard movie made about his life. A lot of people can't make that claim. So the Republicans came out triumphant. And, I want to point this out, and you need to keep all this in mind. The commentators throughout that, on both sides of the political aisle, the conservative media and the, I don't know what even to call Rachel Maddow and her crew on MSNBC, who also were suggesting that we don't need to view what Trump did that day on that stage as heroic, of coming up after being shot, where they're starting to say, well, he wasn't even shot. That was like obviously a piece of glass or something that deflected up and injured him. Two different doctors have come out and said, no, about the top corner of his ear is gone. That wasn't some kind of artificial wound. And you can actually say, have you seen that photo by the New York Times reporter you can actually see the bullet milliseconds before it struck his ear in the picture. I mean, it's amazing. I think I told you last week when I said something about film speed, my very technical son looked at me and said, No, it's not film. They don't use film anymore. That's shutter speed. It's all digital. And of course, that's what a dinosaur I am. And I apologize for being so ignorant, but I'm not a photographer, so I didn't know any better. But the bottom line is they're already trying to spin that there's nothing heroic about Donald Trump uh, jumping to his feet and defiantly putting his fists in the air and yelling, fight, 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 prompting the crowd to overcome in seconds the shock of shots fired all around them and right over their heads. Uh, it's just a good example of how absolutely biased these people are. But he sweeps out of that convention with this great situation. And you heard commentators on both MSNBC, on CNN, and on Fox News saying, well, there's so much momentum here and so much going on at the Republican convention. At least all of the talk about Joe Biden stepping down has quieted now. It looks like it's going to be Trump and Biden. I think the poll was like 78% of the country did not want to see a Trump Biden rematch. Well, they got their wish because almost immediately, within 24 hours, after all the commentators were saying it looks like Joe Biden's position is solidified, wrong. That's not what happened. Joe Biden was being barraged by a variety of sources telling him that he needed to step aside and give the mantle to somebody else, based on predicated on the fact that they were telling him he can't win because they have information available to them that you and I don't have. We get general totals of these polls that really mean nothing. When you hear that Donald Trump is 4 points ahead of Joe Biden nationally, that's a poll reflecting on calling people all over the country. And of course, with the most population in California and New York and Texas, those numbers are going to reflect the opinions of a lot of those people as much and a lot more than there's probably a half a dozen people in Montana. So you're not going to get much feedback from those kind of states. And so when they tell you in a national poll, that means nothing. That's why we have an electoral college. It's not a democracy. It's not the most votes you get. It's where you get the votes and how you earn the vote or the endorsement in the electoral college from all 50 states. So in that particular poll, you find out, and believe me, all of the parties pay unbelievable amounts of money. Trump let it slip in a speech this Saturday up in Wisconsin. He said, let's do a quick poll. And he asked the audience, who would you rather run against? And he asked them Biden or Kamala. And people shouted and cheered or booed and clapped. He goes, well, thank you so much for that poll. That just saved me about $300,000 out of the campaign fund to get that free opportunity for a poll. So they're paying, let's just say a couple of $1 million a month minimum to get the most in-depth information. And the Democrat Party leaders, all during the hoopla of the Republican convention, saw the writing on the wall. Joe Biden had no chance. He was a done deal. After the debate on June 27th, and that's another rapid place on the timeline where things have become very evident because they perpetrated the big lie for so long, including the current candidate, Kamala Harris, saying almost weekly, I spend time with Joe Biden. He is vigorous. He is so engaged. He's making every decision. It turns out it's total BS. And I've told you it's total BS on this show and other commentators. If you look for it, people that are paying attention knew exactly what we had here. And let me make the most important point that I'm going to make on this show as time winds down, and like it always does. This has nothing to do whatsoever. Nothing to do with Joe Biden's mental place right now, with the fact that that he has obviously fast developing dementia symptoms. He has periods where he actually literally freezes up. If you listen, I'm absolutely flabbergasted. Remember, to prove that he was lucid and engaged and capable of the job, uh, about 10 days ago, he held a what they were calling, and this is ridiculous for an 81-year-old man, a big boy press conference, which was a press conference that supposedly didn't have any Fed lines. This was a place where Biden was going to come out and answer questions from a variety of media and show that he was lucid and engaged and knew what was going on. And it was proclaimed a success at the time because Joe was able to stand there and answer questions for about an hour and a half. But what they don't tell you is, and if you don't really watch the actual presentation, there were 14 different times when Joe Biden would be answering a question, when he would go, and that situation when I sat down with this leader, well, anyway, he said, well, anyway, 14 times. Well, anyway was, I can't think of what I wanted to say. That's how he was finishing sentences. Well, anyway, that is a flashing light, 5 alarms, siren that's telling you that he can't complete a thought and convey it into words. And everybody was proclaiming, well, he passed that test. And I'm yelling at the commentators on TV saying, no, he didn't. Well, anyway, no, he didn't. But the handwriting was on the wall. As soon as he said, I'm going to get out there and prove that I'm the candidate that you need to support, and he embarked on an ambitious couple of days of going around and making presentations at different targeted events, particularly as usual in Pennsylvania and close to home in Virginia, where the first couple stops. And then he made the fateful trip last week during the Republican convention out to Las Vegas. He had a full schedule the first day, culminated by the address to the NAACP meetings that were going on in Vegas, delivered a speech at night. The next day, Wednesday last week, he went out to his morning campaign event and started telling the people around him that he was exhausted and he was sick. He was coughing. He had a runny nose. They run a test and declare that Joe Biden, for the third time, despite being jabbed with vaccines and boosters more times, he took more jabs than every opponent that fought Muhammad Ali in his career took collectively. Joe Biden, despite being boosted and injected with all kinds of things that were supposed to prevent the development of COVID, supposedly had COVID again and had to be shut down. This was the indicator, folks. This guy doesn't have any stamina. This guy can't even stand the rigors of a 5 or 6 day active schedule. This is why every weekend in his presidential term, this president of the United States on Friday mornings, goes to Delaware and doesn't come back to Washington till Monday nights. He was basically a 3-day work week president who only worked partial time. You never hardly saw him after nightfall. Remember, the information has come out that from 10 to 4, Joe was pretty effective. After that or before that, not so much. If you were paying attention, you knew exactly what the situation was. But the thing is, he has been known by people around him, and people in the leadership of the Democrat Party has known this from day one. But the problem is they were fine with it because he was doing exactly what they needed him to do. So don't buy the rotten banana, that the reason Joe Biden is being forced out by Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffrey. The reason he's being forced out is not because he has cognitive problems and is not capable of being the president. He's being knocked out because the puppet that they've had at the head of the party, while the people behind the scenes pulled the strings and ran everything, mostly people on his own staff who were Obama officials, he's being pulled because their internal polling, the most sophisticated polling there is, shows that he was hopelessly buried in terms of having any chance of winning, because those 7 or 8 swing states are all the ones that matter. It doesn't matter what happens in Texas or California or New York. You know which way they're going to go. Or now Florida, 4 of the biggest states that determine this thing. It's kind of a standoff between Texas and Florida and New York and California. So it comes down to Georgia. It comes down to Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, along with Ohio and Michigan. Virginia is back in play. North Carolina. These are the states where both sides have had success. And these are the states where Donald Trump, in internal polling, was stomping Joe Biden's ass. And Joe Biden was not going to be able to win. So they have to pull the plug and make an emergency change here before just going to the slaughterhouse. And it's not just for the presidency, it's the tremendous concern they have, because they can weather a Trump term if they can maintain control of the Senate, especially. But either of the 2 branches of Congress, they have to keep the House, or have to retake the House, or keep the Senate, to kind of negate the effect of the Donald Trump blast to their agenda that has made huge advances in the last few years. Because with Joe as the figurehead, they've been able to initiate a lot of the policies that they want to do. All the green energy scam, all of the different things that they have in place have been moving along very swimmingly. And now Trump threatens once again to be, sorry, Miley Cyrus, but Donald Trump is the wrecking ball. That should be his theme song in his campaign, because he's going to come into Washington like a wrecking ball and try and knock down so much of what they've built in this basically 3 terms of the Obama administration. Because make no mistake, behind the scenes, Barack Obama has pulled the strings here and done everything he wanted to do, or wished he could have done in his own administration, but he's too savvy a politician. This is the ideal role, being the wizard behind the curtain, pulling the cranks, using the levers, pushing the buttons to all the events. And Donald Trump is the worst nightmare that these people can imagine, as well as the worst nightmare for all of these tens of thousands of hangers on in the federal government, because Trump has a plan to kind of change that whole equation, where these people are not immune to being replaced, that these people can be eliminated from their positions, and really reduce the bloated federal government that runs everything. These people that you and I don't even know their names, making policy decisions. We didn't vote for them. It's like Monty Python. When he comes to a problem, the commoner, and the guy says, "Who are you?" And he goes, "I'm your king." He says, "Well, I didn't vote for you." Well, that's the kind of system we're living in. Let me give you one more thought, and I got to go. Vivek Ramaswamy spoke at the Republican convention. He's in his 30s. This guy is dynamic. I mean, he's a businessman, but he's just a tremendous speaker. Has great ideas. He's a rising star in American politics. But after his speech, he was on one of the late night shows. And the host asked him, "Well, you're probably in a position where you can kind of pick your spot in the Trump administration. What cabinet post would you like?" And he goes, "Well, I don't know, but I do kind of like deportation." And the host was kind of taken aback and said, "Oh, okay." And he goes, "Oh, but you might be thinking I'm referring to the 10 million people in the country illegally. I'm in favor of that kind of deportation. But the kind of deportation I want to specialize in is getting a cleanup of Washington and deporting about 100,000 government workers that are in jobs where they have lifetime positions and don't do anything except for ruin lives for Americans. That's the kind of deportation, getting them out of Washington, that I'm interested in." I thought that was brilliant, and I think that's exactly what needs to happen. But that's why there's such adamant political opposition to Trump, because Trump is going to turn everything upside down this time and get this country back in a position where it's supposed to be by its conception, its constitution, and its founding principles. And again, I am not a Donald Trump lover. I'm just an absolute hater in what this transition team, prompted by Barack Obama, has managed to accomplish in these 12 years that they've been in charge. 8 years directly of Obama and 4 years under the puppet Joe Biden. I was going to talk about Kamala Harris today. We don't have time. We'll do that next week. She's not even a slam dunk to be the nominee, but certainly it's looking like they can't get around putting someone up there who, again, let me say one more key word: teleprompter. Joe Biden even still was able to read to some extent, although he messed up some lines. But with the teleprompter and the technology right in front of you, where you're basically just reading the words of somebody else, it's not that hard a job to make a presentation. I worked my whole life making public speeches and talking to crowds and addressing different people. I've never had a teleprompter. There are people that are completely incapable of standing up, just like I'm doing now. I have no notes. I've talked to you now for almost 45 minutes, I guess, and just off the top of my head. It's an ability that a lot of people don't have, and I'm blessed to have that. But this isn't about me. The point is, Kamala Harris will be fine going to events as long as she has her teleprompter to read other people's words. But if she gets in a situation where she has to do press conferences, where reporters ask her questions that aren't pre-done, and they'll cheat like that, like they always do, they'll tell exactly what questions they're going to ask, or be told what questions to ask. So she's got her set to answers all set, but she gets in any impromptu situation, God forbid a debate. This woman has proven that she cannot form words very quickly in her mind. I think a lot of that is her cautiousness of saying something ridiculous. So she talks like a word at a time, and another person who just can't, off the cuff, be able to communicate effectively with the people she's trying to speak to. So let me warn you, this is another teleprompter candidate. It's another puppet with limited. Joe Biden had his mental capacity diminished. Kamala Harris doesn't have much to start with. She dropped out of her presidential run in 2020 after just a month. Everybody that worked in her campaign quit. As vice president, she's hated by staff. She's had about 75% turnover. They talk about her being lazy, unwilling to really do the work necessary to educate herself on issues. If she gets on the stage and she gets in a debate situation, she will be exposed immediately, and the American people will realize that all we're doing is replacing one fraud with another. And that's the strategy, because they don't want an effective nominee. They want somebody they can completely control, who just wants the trappings of being in the office and being the president, and are willing to go along with anything in exchange for that. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks for tuning in. Kip Kiefer Need to Know, going different directions than some of the things that I was going to talk about, but I hope made some points that make you think. And again, the whole idea here is for you to think for yourself. Have a great week, everybody. God bless America. Hang in there. It's a wild ride, and I'm sure by this time next Monday, there's going to be a whole lot of new subjects to talk about here on TKR. All the best. God bless you and your family. I'm Kip Kiefer. See you next week.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio.